Good morning. Well, I am recording this at one of my favourite spots overlooking Brandon Hill, on Brandon Hill, overlooking the harbour, and I'm going to be continuing our box set series of talks exploring the letters written by Saul the Apostle. Now, I rarely receive letters in the post anymore, but one dear friend called Christine, who we got to know like 24 years ago in Reading, usually writes to us at least 3 times a year, and it's full of news about her family, about what they've been getting up to, and there's lots of personal detail and nuance in the letters that people who aren't familiar with the context of our relationship just wouldn't get. Now, in the Bible, Saul's letters are the same, but because these letters are in the Bible, we can sometimes forget that they're actually personal letters written by Saul to a group of people with whom he has a relationship and many shared experiences. The only exception to that would be the book of Romans. But the big problem with Saul's letters and understanding Saul's letters is that we only generally hear one side of the conversation. If only we had the correspondence from the Thessalonians and the Corinthians, perhaps even Philemon, we might find it easier to understand Paul's letters better. Not only do we fail to hear the other side of the conversation, but we can also fail to appreciate that Saul and those that he's corresponding with actually lived in a very different culture and a very different time. And this is really important because aside from Jesus, Saul is without doubt the dominant influence on the history of Christianity over the last 20 centuries. And over the last 20 centuries, I think it's fair to say that Saul's letters have been lifted out of context and used to justify all manner of despicable policies like slavery, the subjugation of women, and the condemnation of homosexuality. Now, in the first 4 episodes of this box set on Saul, we have got to know something of Saul's background. He's a passionate Jew, he's proud of his ethnicity, he's a Roman citizen, he's well educated, he's a gifted religious lawyer and an artisan. We can see from his letters that he was a really intelligent person and he was very opinionated. But he was not primarily a religious writer. He was writing about philosophy, about ethics, about culture, about politics, about economics, as well as theology. But he's a man of his time, and that time period was really different to the world that we now live in. So we really have to be careful not to just lift his writing out of his cultural context and apply it bluntly to our own context now. I just want to encourage you that since Saul's letters, each of Saul's letters are unique and specific, we need to look at all of them as individual letters. So we're going to take each of the 7 undisputed letters of Saul in chronological order, and today we're focusing on his first letter to the Thessalonians. Now, this is likely to be Saul's earliest letter that we know about, written to a group of households in Thessalonica in Greece. Now, the story of Saul and the Thessalonians is described in Luke in Acts 17 verses 1 to 10. So if you've got a Bible, then you can pull that up if you've got it on your phone. So Acts 17. When Saul and his companions had passed through Amphipolis and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica, where there was a Jewish synagogue. And as was his custom, Saul went into the synagogue, and on 3 Sabbath days he reasoned with them from the Scriptures, explaining and proving that the Messiah had to suffer and rise from the dead. "This Jesus I am proclaiming to you is the Messiah," he said. And some of the Jews were persuaded and joined Paul and Silas, as did a large number of God-fearing Greeks and quite a few prominent women. But other Jews were jealous, so they rounded up some bad characters from the marketplace, formed a mob, and started a riot in the city. They rushed to Jason's house in search of Saul and Silas in order to bring them out to the crowd. But when they did not find them, they dragged Jason and some other believers before the city officials, shouting, "These men who have caused trouble all over the world have now come here, and Jason has welcomed them into his house. They are all defying Caesar's decrees, saying there is another king, one called Jesus." When they heard this, the crowd and the city officials were thrown into turmoil. Then they put Jason and the others on bail and let them go. And as soon as it was night, the believers sent Saul and Silas away to Berea. Now, it's super important to understand that Saul was a religious and political insurgent. And I say religious and political because politics and religion were intertwined, rather like they are in places like Iran and Saudi Arabia and Pakistan. Religion and politics were the same thing in the Roman Empire. From Emperor Augustus onwards, the Roman Emperor was also the chief priest, and emperors that were considered especially good were retrospectively declared to be gods. The worship of gods and idols shaped every aspect of Roman and Greek life. Every city had its own idols and temples and festivals and rituals. You might see something similar in villages and towns across India, and of course Latin cultures in Spain and Portugal and countries in South and Central America have hundreds of saints' days and festivals and rituals. Now, the extent of the influence of Roman Greek gods can still be seen in the names of our days, our months and our planets, certainly in Latin and in languages like French and Spanish and Italian. Mars, Jupiter, Saturn and Pluto. All these names keep coming up in our everyday language. So religious idols and temples and rituals and festivals and food and clothing and art was of course central to everyday life in the Roman Empire, and religion and politics were really the same thing. So in 52 AD, Saul sets off on his first missionary journey, and he arrives in Thessalonica, and he goes to the synagogue and persuades many of the Jews and the God-fearing Gentiles that Jesus is the Messiah. Now, as he found in all the places he went around the Mediterranean basin, many other Jews are jealous of Saul, so they cause a riot and report Saul to the Roman authorities, saying that he is claiming that Jesus Christ is the true emperor, not Caesar. And they were right, because that is what Saul was saying. He was undermining the social, the religious, and the political stability of the Roman Empire. Jews fiercely believed then and believe now that there is only one God, and they refused to participate in the worship of the hundreds of Roman gods and idols. The trouble is, Roman gods and idols were absolutely central to life in Roman towns and villages, and so consequently Jews like Saul found themselves separated from the everyday life of Roman towns and villages where they lived. They were a bit like the expat communities living in countries like Spain. If you go to Benidorm in Spain, you'll find British and Irish bars serving bacon, eggs and black pudding and serving ale and cider. Parts of southwest France is so full of British expats it's known as Dordogne. These Jews would have lived in like expat communities in Roman towns and villages, but Saul goes one step further though, in that he doesn't just refuse to participate in Roman cultural life. He asserts that Jesus has not just equal authority to the Roman Emperor, but greater authority, and that everyone should defer to Jesus rather than to Caesar. Now just imagine a Christian or a Jew doing that in Saudi Arabia or Iran. You are going to get yourself arrested, if not beaten up. Is it any wonder that later in the letter he urges the Thessalonians to make it their ambition to lead a quiet life, mind their own business, so that they can win the respect of the wider community? This is the background to the letter that Saul writes to the Thessalonians. And not long after, he moves on to the next town on his journey. And he begins this letter starting with giving thanks for their allegiance to Jesus rather than to Caesar. And that word allegiance is important. That's exactly what it means. It means allegiance. It's a bit like where your allegiance is with a sports team. Like I support Manchester United. My allegiance is with them. So this morning, because Liverpool have just won the Premiership for the first time in 30 years, I'm feeling a bit sad. And I'm thinking that Manchester City lost on purpose to Chelsea. Such is my allegiance to Manchester United. And in the same way, but with much greater commitment, Saul starts his letter by giving thanks for the Thessalonians' allegiance to Jesus rather than to Caesar, saying that they have become famous for their allegiance to Jesus. You know, you can sense the emotional attachment that Saul has made to these people with phrases like in chapter 2, it says this, just as a nursing mother cares for her children, so we cared for you, because we loved you so much. We were delighted to share with you not only the gospel of God, but our lives as well. There's a man that's really connected to these people emotionally. And I think that Saul is someone, when you read his letters, Saul is someone who seems to wear his heart on his sleeve, which accounts for the amazing emotional intensity and the variation in emotional intensity. It kind of swings and ebbs and flows. I imagine that he had difficulty hiding his emotions. And from his letters, we can see that he seemed to always be defending his reputation, as he does in the first part of chapter 2. And that's because, most likely, these jealous Jews that we read about in Acts 17 are really questioning Saul's message in his absence, and really, they're really casting aspersions on his conduct and character. And so, as we see in a number of letters, Saul spends some time actually rebutting his critics. Saul can't return to the Thessalonians as he's focused on his work in Athens now, so he sends Timothy to check on his friends. And honestly, I'm sure he's deeply distressed because he thinks that his friends are being harassed by the other Jews in the town, and he's worried that they may have abandoned their allegiance to Jesus. And so his relief is palpable in chapter 3 verse 7, where he says, "Therefore, brothers and sisters, in all our distress and persecution," that's that they're experiencing in Athens, "we were encouraged by you because of your faith." About 6 weeks ago, I planted some grass seed in our garden, and for several weeks nothing sprouted from the seed, but in the last 2 or 3 weeks it really has grown into just this amazing fresh green patch of grass in the middle of my lawn, which is pretty much daisies and weeds. Every day I would go out to see whether the seed was growing, and in some ways that's a metaphor really for what was going on with Saul here. He's planted the seed of the gospel in the lives of the Thessalonians, and he's anxious to see that it's growing and taking root. So then in chapter 4, he turns his attention to other matters, by which he means sexual immorality. Now, he doesn't say as much about it in this letter as he does, as we'll see, in his other letters, but as we will see with his other letters, he tends to speak about sexual immorality and idolatry more than any other behavioural issues. It's tempting to simply impose our cultural assumptions on Saul's words here, but the cultural context of Saul's world was very different from ours, especially in sexual terms. Now, whilst it might seem that Roman society embraced an anything-goes attitude to sexuality, there were actually rigid rules to regulate proper sexual conduct, but not the sort of rules that we might, unwritten rules that we might observe today. The most common rule related to gender. It's pretty difficult for us to understand the degree to which patriarchy dominated ancient societies. It still does have a pervasive influence in our contemporary societies, but the influence of men, the dominance of men in ancient societies was like so much greater than it is in our contemporary society. So if you think it's bad now, it is nothing compared to what it used to be in ancient societies like Roman and Greek society. And men were considered to be the highest expression of humanity, for which, as a man, I must apologise and say that I am embarrassed. But of course, this is something that pervades our society even now. Aristotle, the Greek philosopher, argued that girls were born only when something went wrong in the womb. Had the fetus truly reached its potential, he said it would have become a boy, and he even described the female as a deformed male. Even Plato, who is considered to be the most pro-women of the ancient Greek philosophers, believed that men who were cowardly or unrighteous would be reincarnated as women. Women were associated with all that was weak, cowardly, irrational, and self-indulgent, and no self-respecting man would behave in any way that would appear to be womanly. Therefore, in Roman society, it was considered normal for an adult male citizen to routinely have sex with slaves, prostitutes, and concubines, regardless of gender. However, it was only acceptable if he took the active role in the encounter. If he took the passive role, like the role of the slave, the woman, the concubine, he would be dishonoured and shamed by his peers. Plutarch, the Greek philosopher, wrote, "We class those men who enjoy the passive part as belonging to the lowest depth of vice, and allow them not the least degree of confidence or respect or friendship." And that was all to do with the way in which men viewed their dominance in society. As long as the male was the active, dominant partner in a sexual encounter, it was considered normal for a married man to have sex with multiple partners throughout his life. And this led to abuses that are criminal in modern society. Seneca, a Roman philosopher, wrote that a slave often must remain awake throughout the night, dividing his time between his master's drunkenness and his lust. Cicero, writing about Roman soldiers dividing the spoils of war, said this: "Married ladies, maidens, and free-born boys are carried off and handed over to the soldiers." There were social limits that helped to curb this excess, as men who engaged in too much sex were considered irrational and effeminate and unable to control their sexual desire. Sadly, in that society, these are all traits that they associated with women, and men who engaged in too much sex really were looked down upon for doing so. But in general, free Roman men used their dominant position in society to indulge their sexual desires at the expense of their wives, slaves, and prostitutes, many of whom we would consider children. And it is in this context that Saul makes the comments to the Thessalonians in chapter 4, verses 3 to 5. "It is God's will that you should be sanctified, that you should avoid sexual immorality, that each of you should learn to control your body in a way that is holy and honourable, not in passionate lust like the pagans," by which he means Gentiles, "who do not know God, and that in this matter no one should wrong or take advantage of a brother or sister." Now that word there for sexual immorality in Greek is porneia, from which we get the word pornography. And it means sexual relations between people who are not married to each other. You would think, wouldn't you, that Saul's perspective on this was rooted in his Jewish heritage, and you would be right and you would be wrong. In Mosaic law, the law of Moses, sexual sin was one of a handful of crimes punishable by death. Nevertheless, the revered Jewish patriarchs that predate the Mosaic law, Abraham and Jacob, had more than one wife or concubine. Their famous kings David and Solomon, who lived after Moses in the light of the Mosaic law, had numerous wives, and add to that the ancient Jewish practice of arranging for their girls to be married around the age of 13 years old, often to older men, you have a confusing Jewish heritage. Jesus, though, clearly endorsed lifelong covenantal marriage between one man and one woman. But Jesus is recorded in the Gospels as saying very little else about sexual immorality. The standout example is in Matthew 19, where Jesus is recorded as saying that adultery was the only reason to justify divorce, and even that statement is a little different in Luke and Mark's account of Jesus' life. So where does Saul's justification come from? Well, I think it's Jesus' focus on lifelong covenantal relationship between two people, which reflects the faithful covenantal relationship between Yahweh, the Jewish name for God, and Abraham, and therefore, by definition, all of Abraham's descendants, all of Abraham's seed, which would include the whole of humanity, theologically. Now, given the cultural context of male Roman citizens abusing slaves, women and children to satisfy their own sexual appetites, Saul's instruction to the Thessalonian men was clear: control your sexual urges, be faithful to your spouse, and stop taking sexual advantage of your brother and sister. Typically, Saul doesn't mince his words here. He condemns the sexual abuse with the same emotional force as we do in our society. He says, therefore, anyone who rejects the instruction does not reject a human being but God, the very God who gives you his Holy Spirit. So the final section of Saul's letter reveals that he is convinced that Jesus will return before the end of his own life. And that is such an important consideration when we're thinking about Saul and his letters and what he means. The idea that Saul was convinced that Jesus would return before he died, well, that shapes a lot of his theology. It shapes a lot of his words in his letters, and that's such a big subject that I did a talk on it. My last talk, episode 4, called "Imminent," is all about that, and it's based on this part of Thessalonians, so you can listen to that online. So there we go. Saul's letter to the Thessalonians is a short, very personal, and specific letter to their situation. Just like our letters from our friend Christine, we need to know about the correspondent. We need to know about the recipient, and we need to know about the relationship between the correspondent, Saul, and the recipient, the Thessalonians, the relationship with each other, if we want to understand the letter and not take it out of context. So I wonder this morning, as you've listened to this, what has surprised you about this letter? What has caught your attention? Is there anything that speaks into your own life in Saul's encouragement to the Thessalonians? What might the Holy Spirit be saying to you through this letter today? Just take a moment just to reflect on that. You might want to take some time this week just to read through 1 Thessalonians and just think of it like we've talked about today. Think of it as a specific letter addressing specific concerns between these two groups of people. And ask the Holy Spirit just to speak to you about what you're learning from that letter, and speak to you if there's anything in your own life that He wants to address through it. Holy Spirit, I pray that we would really connect with you, and that through this letter there would be an increased sense of your presence in our life. And we're going to go back to Mal, and Mal will be just sharing with you some words of prophecy that others who've been praying ahead of this service and during the service have forwarded to him. So thanks for listening, and we'll hand back to Mal now.